Father, we thank you for this opportunity to come together here and to look at some topics from your book of nature that may help to instruct us and may guide us. Please abide with us now. Open our ears and our hearts to the message you have for us. In Jesus' name I pray. Amen. Hello again. I was initially contacted by Mokanedi to do a presentation for you at this camp meeting regarding the current state of affairs in the world regarding genetically modified organisms, or GMOs, particularly in regard to our food system. I have quite a bit that I'm going to share with you today. The primary message that I care to leave you with is that this is a topic that we need to understand more thoroughly. I believe there are great risks that many of us are exposed to if we're not conscious of the fact that these things are in our diets. Particularly those of us in the developed world have had tremendous impact and influence from the consumption of these genetically modified foods. And I also want to dispel some of the myths about GMOs. As with all things information-wise in the world today, there are extremes. We have on the one hand the companies that are promoting this technology and developing this science to better produce our food at a lower price and at a greater profit for them. We also have an anti-GMO movement that is focused oftentimes on more sensational aspects of this topic, and the information that they're using is not well grounded in science at times. It is somewhat sensational in its delivery and in its impact, and somewhat erroneous too. One of the greatest challenges that we have in this world today is developing the discernment to determine truth from error in practical areas of our life. This is something that we work at with diligence when it comes to our Bible studies and understanding the doctrines of the Bible that are important for our salvation. But it's also important to comprehend what's going on in terms of the book of nature regarding what is happening in the physical world around us, how we can protect our health, how that health can allow us to have clear minds so that we can have the discernment necessary in these final days. Genetic modification of crops began about 20 years ago, and the term that was applied initially to GMOs was genetic engineering. And I kind of like this graphic here because it demonstrates in a fashion the haphazard nature of what genetic engineering or the production of GMOs really consists of. You know, in traditional plant breeding and developing a new hybrid, oftentimes a plant breeder will have to make 10,000 or so crosses to get the desired results that he wants. If he's trying to grow a broccoli that has a larger head that might be a little bit more resistant to drought conditions, he selects two parents of that same species, the same plant, and cross-pollinates those in order to develop a variety that has the characteristics that he wants. And that's, as I said, it takes about 10,000 crosses to create that. In the laboratories where they're doing work with GMOs, oftentimes it takes 20,000 or more attempts at this genetic engineering in order to achieve the results that are desired by the company that is trying to make this cross. And that, to me, is not engineering at all. That's a very haphazard mechanism for trying to impart characteristics to a plant. We have here in the United States a list of the foods that have been approved for the diets of Americans that contain genetically modified characteristics. And that list is what you see here on this slide. I want to emphasize that these are U.S. approvals only, and there are also other countries that are producing genetically modified foods too. And an important aspect of protecting ourselves from these GMO crops and yeasts and bacteria and enzymes is to select food that is whole food rather than processed food. I say that in part because the first 4 or 5 items on this list, the canola, cotton, sugar, soybeans, and corn, are utilized in a variety of ways in processed foods. There are aspects of isolating certain proteins from these crops that are then used to enhance the characteristics of a processed food, whether it comes out of a box or a can or a jar. And in the case, for example, of something like a spaghetti sauce, the total constituents in that jar aren't just tomatoes. There's a lot of other things in there too. Soy protein isolates, corn syrup, in some instances sugar from sugar beets. And the reality is that most processed foods contain some element of genetically modified organisms. And I'll get into a little bit later why I see this as an issue regarding our health. But I just want to make you aware of these things are prevalent in the marketplace today, and they are very much more prevalent in foods that are processed. Now, internationally, we have a number of other foods to add to this list. This is a list here of a few of the items that are produced internationally. And part of the challenge that we have in discerning what's good and what isn't in our food supply is that, at least in America, in the United States specifically, no labeling is required on genetically modified foods. This means that when you pick up a package at the supermarket or you're looking at a label on a processed food, you're not going to be able to identify whether the constituents in that jar or that box are genetically modified or not. And this creates a situation where regulatory interests have really taken advantage of this aspect of no labeling. And because of that, there is no way to monitor the health and safety of genetically modified foods, because if we don't know what we're consuming and there's no indication that that has a GMO constituent in it, how do we draw cause to effect? How can we develop a database of information that points to a specific aspect of a food or a specific element in the food that has caused a health concern or a health situation? This is true in other countries around the world too. Fortunately, Europe has some pretty stringent labeling laws, and as a consequence, Europeans are exposed to far less genetically modified food than we are here in America. And I will say that since they've been in the American diet now for almost 20 years, that if we want to look to the safety and efficacy of genetically modified foods, all we have to do is look at the health of the American population. The American population, as you're probably well aware of, is one of the most unhealthy populations in the world, despite being one of the wealthiest countries and one of the countries with the greatest access to a variety of foods from around the world and also that are produced here. But we also have the world's highest rates of things like diabetes, hypertension, heart disease, some forms of cancer, many instances of health issues that can be correlated with the consumption of genetically modified foods over time in a population that is somewhat susceptible. And aside to this, and this is just a personal question that I ask myself, is when we look at what's currently happening in the world with this COVID-19 pandemic, the U.S. is one of the countries that has been hardest hit by this pandemic. Part of that may be political, part of it may be social, part of it's economic, but I think there's also a potential that the risk for more serious effects from COVID-19 is higher in the United States because our immune systems are under constant attack from the constituents in our diet that are genetically modified. When this science was first being developed, one of the first crops that was genetically modified and entered the food chain in a large way were varieties of corn. And as I pointed out on the previous list, corn is a constituent in all kinds of processed foods in various different forms. And one of the problems they initially had with these genetically modified corn varieties was that it triggers an allergic response in some people. And that low-level allergic response keeps our immune system in a state of very hyperactivity, if you will. And when you add something like a virus into that system too, our immune systems are perhaps more quickly overwhelmed than people that have more of a sound diet. 39 countries, as of this point in time, are currently developing GM crops of their own, and they're also developing trees, insects, and animals as well. Here in the U.S., about a year and a half ago, genetically modified salmon were approved for human consumption. Now, to my knowledge, those have not been fully commercialized yet, but they are an example of part of this technology that's taking place. The world environment for genetically modified foods is very, very accepting at this point in time. Countries that just a few years ago had made statements that they would not accept genetically modified foods are in fact now producing them, growing them, and developing their own also. This slide here is from an organization called ISAA, which is kind of an information source for genetically modified activities around the world. And this slide was produced back in 2016, but at that point in time, over 404 events, GM events, have been listed in their database. Now, an event is when a gene is taken from one species and transferred to another species. This is something that cannot happen in nature. This is not at all a natural system. This is where we take a snippet of DNA from an animal, a virus, a bacteria, or another plant and insert it into a crop that we then grow for food. So just the fact that there have been 404 instances of that indicates the large nature and the wide spectrum of things that can be going on that we know very little about. Part of the challenge with discovering information about GMOs is that in most countries, and specifically here in the United States, that type of research is considered confidential business information. And until they actually make application to one of our government agencies to approve the crop to be grown and approve it to be consumed by humans, we don't know what they're working with. We don't know what is going on. And that's quite a challenge for those of us that are trying to protect ourselves from not only those items that are in the marketplace today, but those that will be coming into the marketplace in a relatively short period of time. This next slide indicates where GMOs are being grown around the world today. And initially, the United States, the population here was the guinea pigs for GMOs, if you will. And we're still by far the largest producer of GMOs, but we're only producing about less than 40% of the world's supply of GMOs now. All of these other countries that you see listed here, and I know that this is probably a hard medium for you to see, but I want to point out that in your neighborhood, in your neck of the woods, South Africa is growing GMO corn, soybeans, and cotton at this time. There's work being done on some citrus varieties that are exported from South Africa. Eswatini, I hope I'm pronouncing that right, used to be Zambia, is growing GMO cotton. Malawi, Ethiopia, Sudan, and Nigeria are also growing GMO crops. The Far East has quite a few acres of GMO crops being planted too, and much of Latin America is producing GMO crops as well. Spain is kind of the standout in the European Union. Spain and Portugal are both growing or have approved GMO corn for being produced in those countries. But far and away, the largest producer of GMOs is still here in the U.S. And the industrial countries are banking heavily on this. The U.S., Canada, Australia, and as I said, Spain and Europe are countries that have really embraced this technology and flooded the food supplies, not just within their countries, but internationally also. And many of these crops are commodity crops, meaning that they get shipped all over the world. And they are commingled with other types of those crops that may not be genetically modified. Corn from the United States for example, and soybeans are shipped all over the world. And some of those crops, even if they're not GMOs, are commingled with corn varieties that are, and there's no distinction or designation. So we're kind of at the point now where we have to assume that all of the crops that have been approved for human consumption that are GMOs, even though there are acreages of those crops that are not genetically modified, they get commingled and combined in the transportation process and the storage process, so all of them have a level of genetically modified contamination within them. China also and India are developing GMOs in a large way, and much of Latin America now, which initially refused to produce GMOs, is growing GMOs in a very large way too, particularly Brazil, Paraguay, and Uruguay. The process of genetic modification is kind of a complicated thing to comprehend, and it's quite a complicated process that starts with a characteristic in plants that allows an entire plant to be reproduced from a single cell. This we call cloning, and in the plant kingdom that's actually can be a natural process. When we think of things like strawberries or blackberries or some other types of plants that send out a runner from the parent plant, and that runner takes root, and if it's separated from the parent plant, it's a genetically identical copy of that parent plant. And that cloning in plants, as I said, is a normal, natural characteristic of plants. In animals and other forms of life, it's not. But in plants, that's not necessarily a violation of natural rules or natural potential of plant cells. When a plant is genetically modified, that's actually what they do, is they start with modifying a single cell within the plant. And that single cell has a nucleus that also has a set of genetic instructions in the DNA on the chromosome. And what genetically modified plants accomplish is the insertion of DNA from a totally different species. As I said, it can be a bacteria, a virus, another type of plant, or even an animal, into the DNA of this, for example, a corn plant. That DNA from the inserted species controls characteristics of the plant that enable it to, in most instances, be resistant to herbicides. In some instances, it makes them produce their own insecticides so that the plant itself is the pesticide that's used on worms, for example, that might want to eat the corn plant. With every bite the worm takes, it gets some of the DNA from that soil bacteria that is toxic to the worm, and it ingests an amount, and it basically dies of poisoning. The difference between spraying our plants with poison and genetically modified plants that actually manufacture the poison is that every cell within that plant has a level of that toxicity in it. So we basically created plants that have this characteristic of toxicity to some forms of worms and other insects. Now, we're told that this is safe because the toxins that they're using in these plants are typically not toxic to human beings, or mammals for that matter. But the reality is that the rate of dosage is enormously greater. For example, one of the bacteria that's used in genetically modifying crops is a bacteria called Bt, or Bacillus thuringiensis. Now, Bt was discovered, it's a natural soil bacteria. It was discovered back in the early 40s that this has a very efficacious use in agriculture as a spray on the plants, where a protein is isolated from that Bt and then sprayed on the plant. And the rate of application is about 1 pound per acre of Bt. Sprayed on the plants protects it from insects. This being a rather natural product is actually certified for use for organic growers here in the United States. Many of our organic crops are sprayed with this Bt protein to protect them from worms. The difference is in the sense of magnitude. When we genetically modify that Bt into a plant, we go from a pound per acre to perhaps 20 tons per acre when you consider all of the biomass of not only the corn kernel, but the husk and the leaves and the stalks and the roots. Every portion of that plant contains this insecticide. Now, when we harvest that crop and plow those things into the soil, we really have not done studies that indicate to us that this is entirely safe for soil microbiology. That's one of the aspects of growing healthful crops that is important to me as a grower, is that I have a good, strong microbiome in my soil, bacteria, fungi, arthropods, other types of organic matter in the soil that facilitates the plant's use of nutrients in the soil and helps its growth. Well, we don't have a good concept of what these crops residues will do if they're plowed into that soil, particularly on a year after year basis, and the level of Bt, the toxic protein in the Bt, continues to increase. In crossing this, essentially what we're doing is we're taking a chromosome and we're snipping a piece of it out and we're inserting the DNA from another species, as I said. Now, this sounds like it could be scientific, but the reality is it is now known that this is a very haphazard way of approaching changing the characteristics of a plant. There's a very interesting article that I read back in 2006. It was published in a magazine called Discover Magazine, and this particular article is still on the internet if you choose to look it up. It's called DNA is Not Destiny, written by a man named Ethan Waters, and it's a story about a doctoral professor at Duke University that was studying mice. And he was studying a particular strain of mouse called the agouti mouse. And the agouti mouse is one that was used a lot for research, particularly medical research here in the US, because the mouse itself tends to be overweight, has a predisposition to cancer, and it's slightly yellow in color. And Dr. Girdle decided to take a pregnant agouti mouse and change its diet. And he gave it a methyl-rich diet, which is a diet that's rich in some sulfur compounds. And what he discovered was that the offspring of the mouse whose diet he changed had different characteristics than its parents' agouti mice, that it was normal weight, that it had normal coloring, and that it didn't have the predisposition to cancer. And that's interesting enough. I think all of us would recognize that if we change our diets, we can have better health. But the really fascinating part of this is that that change continued into the third and fourth generation of the offspring of that initial mouse that had that methyl-rich diet. Now, this is fascinating to me. When I first read this article, my jaw just about hit the floor, because what I saw here is actual DNA evidence, physical evidence for the concept that we have in our church of righteousness by faith. By recognizing that simple dietary changes, environmental changes can affect our offspring, not just us, but our offspring, is a fascinating topic to study. I was really frankly amazed when I read this, and since this article has been produced, there are lots of studies now that have confirmed that this characteristic takes place. And the mechanism for this is that certain genes under given conditions are either amplified or basically turned off. That if you think of it as a volume control, that methyl-rich diet that mouse received turned on more positive characteristics for the mouse and turned off some of the DNA that was responsible for some of the negative effects. The term was coined for this as epigenetics. Epigenetics means above the genome, which indicates that the whole science of genetic engineering is on a very, very shaky foundation. Another prominent writer here in the United States writes for the New York Times, Denise Caruso, produced an article in the New York Times called A Challenge to Gene Theory back in 2007. And she pointed out this same evidence that there are characteristics that seem to be above the genome that control how the phenotype or the offspring of plants and animals both can be affected by things other than just the genes. This presents to us a question about, okay, if we have assumed that we take a gene from one species and that might be responsible for a given characteristic and snap it into another species, we should get a given result from that. And that again points back to this reality that it takes 20,000 attempts at doing that before they get the response that they want. Another thing that is important for us to recognize is that there are things occurring right now with genetic science that are not called GMOs, even though it's genetic modification. And the first definition that we have for GMOs is that it's transgenic, and transgenic means just that we've taken a gene from one species and we've inserted that into another species. That's somewhat controlled by science. Most of the science is the proprietary information held by the company that does it. But still, there's a review process for transgenic crops, at least here in the United States, where they undergo some regulation and some testing. But one of the challenges of the regulatory failures here in the United States is if I take a GMO parent, that corn variety, for example, that had the worm toxin in it, and I hybridize it, or I just allow it to naturally crossbreed with another corn variety, I might get an offspring that still has that insecticidal characteristic in it. That's not controlled. Because of that being the next generation, there is no oversight, no control over that whatsoever. We also have a new technology that's being employed to create different characteristics in plants that are not transgenic, but are still a manipulation of the plant's own DNA. One of the interesting qualities of life, and when we examine the genome of life, we're quick to realize that there are far more genes at play than what is necessary simply for the plant to grow. Weeds, for example, have almost twice as many genes as human beings do. And why would this be if they're not as complicated a being as we are? Well, the reality is that a lot of those genes are simply quiet, if you will. They don't express themselves, while other genes express themselves very fully. And again, when we incorporate this concept of epigenetics into this equation, what they've learned how to do is to turn on and turn off certain genes within these plants. This is a technique that is known as CRISPR. It's clustered regularly interspaced palindromic repeats. That's kind of a complex way of saying what this is, and I'll get into a clearer definition of that later. Another aspect that I want to convey here is that we have things that are genetically modified through a variety of methods, transgenic, through CRISPR, through another process I'll describe too. And these are somewhat regulated processes, but when we look at the offspring of these genetically manipulated or genetically modified crops that we have today, there are certain aspects of the way this process works that is totally unregulated. There are no safety studies done on these things to determine whether they're safe for you and I to consume. There are very few, if any, environmental studies on these things to see whether outcrossing takes place, where that GMO characteristic or that modified characteristic of a CRISPR variety, for example, impacts subsequent generations. And this is really a challenging circumstance, because what it means is that even though the original parents of a transgenic GMO variety may undergo some scrutiny from both the company itself, but also government agencies to establish whether it's safe for us to eat or not, any of the offspring are totally unregulated. They simply make the assumption that if it was safe in the first place, its offspring must be safe too. Now, the problem with this is that any patent on the original GMO isn't on the plant itself, it's on the genes that are manipulated in the case of CRISPR, or genes that are transgenic in the case of GMOs that the plant contains. So the patent is on the gene, and patent laws here in the United States, and there's an effort to make this a universal patent aspect of patent law, is that wherever that gene goes, the patent follows the gene. So if you're producing a crop that was originally manipulated in some form, and that gene can be identified in subsequent crops that you might be growing, that the company actually owns the gene in that crop, which by and large means that you own the crop. And in some instances, corporations have actually pursued growers and sued them for either the right to charge them a fee for the use of that gene or to destroy the crop. And that's very troubling to me. That's an egregious invasion of what our food sovereignty should allow us to do. There's no regulation and no testing of any fashion of these crops by a third-party organization to determine their safety. Now, to point this out, the lack of regulation, to point this out, I've got this lengthy quotation here I'd like to read to you. This comes from the United States Government Food and Drug Administration about their policies. This is from their own website and their own webpage. And it's a question and answer format here that I want to read to you because this is really pretty disturbing. For the CRISPR process, the question is posed, what responsibilities do developers have if they want to bring to market a product derived from a plant developed using genome editing techniques? Answer, any company looking to market foods made with genome editing techniques is responsible for complying with all applicable laws and regulations. For more than 20 years, developers have routinely consulted FDA about the safety and regulatory status of foods from new genetically engineered plant varieties prior to marketing. FDA intends to continue offering consultations for developers of new plant varieties, including those produced using genome editing, in order to help developers ensure that applicable safety and legal questions are resolved prior to marketing of food products derived from such new plant varieties. Consultations. Talked earlier about regulations, and frankly, there are none. Question, has the FDA completed any voluntary consultations for genome-edited plant varieties intended for animal or human food? Answer, as of January 18, 2017, the FDA has not completed a voluntary food safety consultation on food derived from a plant produced using genome editing. Essentially, no regulation, no oversight. The company is in charge of this. Now, I want to talk a little bit about where CRISPR came from and how it's utilized. Basically, this graphic is a graphic explanation of what they do, but they snip out a portion of the plant's chromosome and they manipulate the DNA of that chromosome in fashions that follow this pattern. CRISPR is actually a naturally occurring defense mechanism found in a wide range of bacteria. As far back as the 1980s, scientists observed a strange pattern in some bacterial genomes. One DNA sequence would be repeated over and over again with unique sequences in between the repeats. They called this odd configuration clustered regularly interspaced short palindromic repeats, or CRISPR. Scientists realized the unique sequences in between the repeats matched the DNA of viruses, specifically viruses that prey on bacteria. It turns out CRISPR is one part of the bacteria's immune system, which keeps bits of dangerous viruses around so it can recognize and defend against those viruses the next time they attack. That's an explanation of the natural form of CRISPR that nature has utilized to protect bacteria from virus invasion. This is the technique that is used, however, to manipulate characteristics of crops in a way that enhances some characteristics or diminishes other characteristics so that the plant produces a more profitable, a more viable crop, whatever the criteria is that these large companies are utilizing. Some CRISPR-edited crops are already in commerce here in the U.S., probably far more than we know of. These are 4 examples of ones that I was able to research and find. One is a potato called the innate potato, produced by a company named Simplot. It's based in Idaho in the United States. This particular potato is resistant to late blight, or some of the disease that attacks the large russet Burbank potatoes that are used for manufacturing French fries. A company in Canada called Okanagan Specialty Fruits developed an apple that you can slice and leave open to the air and it doesn't turn brown. And this apple was produced because many large institutional buyers, including school systems, used pre-sliced fruit on their fruit bars or in packaging or in ways to basically pre-prepare the food before it's served. And these Arctic apples do not turn brown in that process, therefore they're more appealing to the public. Penn State has developed white mushrooms that involve the use of CRISPR, and Del Monte Corporation has a pink pineapple that was developed using CRISPR technology. There's also another technology that's utilized for gene editing. It's called Talons, and I frankly do not know a lot about this. This is a technology that has been developed fairly recently. And again, it's a method of snipping out certain aspects of the DNA, replacing it with some other aspect of the plant's own DNA rather than transgenic. But again, it's used to enhance certain characteristics and to minimize other characteristics in order to get the desired effect that is wanted in the offspring crop. What this means basically is that the floodgates are open now for hundreds of new variety introductions using these CRISPR technologies or using these gene editing technologies. One of the challenges that companies involved in biotechnology or in traditional genetic modification of plants has been that the American public is far more educated now than it was 20 years ago, and there's a lot of resistance among the consumers here to purchase these products. We become aware of some of the safety hazards, and we become aware of some of the threats to the environment and to farmers themselves from the growing of these crops. But these new CRISPR technologies, since they're unregulated and the only people that know whether one of these plants is edited or not is the company itself that produces it, these are kind of flying under the radar, if you will. The American public is not aware, and indeed the international public is not aware that these things are taking place. So the reality here is that there's even lobbying taking place now. Organic foods are popular here in America because we know our food system is so contaminated these days. There are efforts in place now to make CRISPR-edited crops qualified to be certified for organic use. Independent research indicates there's a high potential for collateral damage and unintended mutations in this process too, much of which we'll never know about, we'll never hear about, because again, it's confidential business information. One of the points that I really want to stress here is that, again, the patents on these types of foods follow the genes through successive generations. And if the gene is present, the patent holder owns the plant. If the gene is present, the patent holder owns the plant. That means out here in my gardens, if I'm growing a variety of broccoli that happen to be the result of CRISPR modification, and I decide to save seed from my broccoli plant and plant it the next season, if they took the effort to come to my farm, analyze the genetic information in that plant, study the DNA, and if that modification was present in my broccoli plant, I could get a bill from them for a license fee for using their gene, or they could condemn my crop. Basically, they own it. This is very, very distressing. And what complicates this even more is that over the last 30 years or so, there has been an immense consolidation of power within the seed industry. About 90% of all the seed in the world today is controlled by 3 companies. That's the 3 companies you see listed here. Bayer recently bought out BASF and Monsanto. Corteva came from the consolidation of DuPont and Dow AgroSciences here in the United States. And a Swiss company, Syngenta, very large seed company, was recently bought out by ChemChina. Now, the reality here is that when you buy seeds, whether from a seed store, a local market, here in the United States, we have a lot of retail seed companies that produce catalogs, and we order out of those catalogs. The reality is that the company we buy our seeds from is not the company that necessarily produced the seed. And the seed producers are largely controlled by these 3 companies who obviously have a vested interest in selecting the seeds that we're going to grow for their profit advantage. And what this means is that a large volume of seeds in the world today that have been traditionally used in the past are no longer being replicated or produced. And when something is no longer replicated or produced, that leads to something that we call extinction. And that has occurred not only with genetically modified varieties, but also traditional hybrid varieties and even some open pollinated varieties that were available just a few years ago are no longer available today. This is very distressing to me because it means that we have a narrowing of the gene pool on a worldwide basis. And a narrow gene pool is a recipe at some point in time for total catastrophe in terms of a plant variety that might be susceptible to a disease that absolutely takes the crop out over a wide range of species. You know, genetic variation and genetic difference is part of the reason why some of us get very sick with COVID and some of us may be asymptomatic to COVID. Part of that is a genetic response due to the variation in the genes between one individual and another. And this narrowing and shallowing, if you will, of the gene pool is really a potential threat to the entire world food supply. A friend of mine named Jeffrey Smith wrote a book, it's probably been 12 or 14 years ago now, called Genetic Roulette. And Jeffrey was looking for health effects from the consumption of genetically modified foods. And what he was able to document are 65 known health effects from consuming GMO foods. And some of these things are listed here. I don't have the full list of them on here, but many of these things we see taking place in the world on an ever-increasing basis. Diabetes, obesity. Some foods have anti-nutritive properties, where when you consume the food, it actually causes your body to expel some of the nutrition that your body holds as a reservoir. There's a lot of immune system dysfunction, antibiotic resistance, anaphylaxis, many types of allergies, asthma, and the list goes on and on. This is very distressing because these health effects are very prominent here in the United States today. If you walk into a hospital and you ask most doctors, what's different today than 20 years ago, and they're going to say that all of the things on this list and some of the others that he has listed in his book have become very, very prominent in the U.S. And the health of Americans has deteriorated immensely in the last 30 or 40 years, largely due to the diet that we eat. And it's not just bad food choices, it's bad nutrition that we're not getting from our food, or anti-nutritive properties, or low-level agitations to our immune system that causes this grief in this respect. You know, the interesting thing that comes to me as an agriculturalist is that when I look to the first 3 chapters in the Bible, particularly when I read Genesis 3, I see that there is a very early, prominent, and thorough call for Adam to till the soil from whence he came. Adam was essentially put in the Garden of Eden. The Lord, I think, gave him that opportunity because it was an opportunity for him to learn from the book of nature those things which he didn't communicate to God in face-to-face conversation. He was able to recognize certain truths about God's nature and God's character by studying the interrelationships of that balanced, harmonious nature. And that that was something that the Lord wanted all of us to have the opportunity to have. In my previous video, I told you that I don't think the Lord called all of us to be agriculturalists, but he certainly wanted agriculture or hands-on work with nature to be a part of our development and our growth in understanding him better. And we see some examples too. When he led the children out of Egypt and put them in Jordan, the idea was to divide the land and provide them with the capacity to have industry in their own environment. It's stated in some of Ellen White's writings that this was the best economy, that people could be independent and develop their lifestyle and take care of their families with the produce of that particular parcel of land. We chose not to follow that counsel, and we've drifted farther and farther away from agriculture. And even in the book of 2 Kings, there are a couple of statements that are made there that kind of lead me to believe that, we need to give more importance to this message that God has laid out for us in his word. In 2 Kings chapter 24 and 25, there are a couple of statements about when the Babylonians came and took their captives, took Israel captive. And there are a couple of interesting statements here. I want to read them to you. One is from 2 Kings verse 24 and chapter 24 and verse 14, where the people are being carried off. And he carried away all Jerusalem, and all the princes, and all the mighty men of valor, even 10,000 captives, and all the craftsmen and smiths. None remained, save the poorest sort of the people of the land. Now, when you look into a definition for the poorest sort of the people of the land, he's basically talking about farmers here, talking about people that work with the soil and produce the food for others. In chapter 25, it's repeated, and when the Lord repeats something, I pay attention to it. Chapter 25 and verse 11, it says, "Now the rest of the people that were left in the city and the fugitives that fell away to the king of Babylon with the remnant of the multitude did Nebuzaradan, the captain of the guard, carry away. But the captain of the guard left the poor of the land to be vine dressers and husbandmen." So here we have a situation where an entire society is being taken away and carried away captive to Babylon. And the people that are left behind, that were protected from that captivity, that were able to maintain their personal lifestyle, I'm sure that there were some impacts of having to be subject to a different ruler, but basically they stayed on the land and they did what they were doing. They were farming and caring for their animals and caring for their vineyards, and were able to continue the lifestyle that they had established and basically were protected from that captivity. Today's captivity is very different. Many of us are held captive right now and we don't even realize it, and that captivity comes in the form of information and choices that we have. And when we look at the factionalized nature of our world today, when we look at the extremes on one side and on the other of the fundamental arguments that are necessary for our liberty, for our protection, the control of that information is a form of captivity. You're captive to what you behold. You become what you behold. And if what you are beholding is a controlled script from large entities that have a hidden agenda, you're going to become captive to that information. And that's certainly prevalent here in America today, and I believe throughout the world to some degree. By having contact with the soil, by having contact with land, by having the security of being able to produce your own food, which is a security that is fundamental. Food is essential. It's an aspect of our lives that we have to have. And if our food system is controlled, the capacity for other entities to manipulate our lives, to control our lives, if you will, is very, very high. And there are very few people in the world today, particularly in the more modern industrial societies, that have any clue about how to feed themselves. This underlying insecurity, if you will, I think is one reason why we see so much confusion in the world today. And of course, the basic bottom line here is that this is a bad idea. This whole concept of genetically manipulating food is a bad idea. And that bad idea is predicated on God's own word in Genesis 1, 11, and 12. And God said, "Let the earth bring forth grass, the herb yielding seed, and the fruit tree yielding fruit after his kind, whose seed was in itself after his kind, and God saw that it was good. And the earth brought forth grass, and the herb yielding seed after his kind, and the tree yielding fruit, whose seed was in itself after his kind, and God saw that it was good." Now that word "kind" in these two verses here can be translated as species. Plants produce after themselves, and when we start tinkering with that process, we're violating God's blueprint for how plants reproduce. I find this very distressing. I find it dangerous. I think it's an example of us using the term GMO. One of my friends says GMO stands for God move over. We're going to take control of this ourselves and feed ourselves in this manner. We have an opportunity still in most of the world to take more responsibility for the food that we eat, both in the choices of what we eat, and in many instances we have opportunities to produce some, if not all, of our food. And that's what we've chosen to do here at Berea Gardens. This is one of the reasons that I feel compelled to share this message with other people, and not just share it with them, but also show them how to do it. You know that we often think that if we're going to grow all of our own food, that we have to spend a whole lot of time at doing it. The reality is that our planet is so productive. God has blessed us in so many ways with the abundance of resource on this planet that in most instances, here in North America anyway, one person working about 30 to 40 minutes a day, 6 days a week, can produce all of the food for a family of 4 people on less than 2 acres. That's the reality of the circumstance. Our land is immensely abundant in its capacity to feed us. And I think it's our responsibility to recognize that by cooperating with the Lord, by fulfilling his first vocation for us, that we can not only protect ourselves physically, but we can gain the spiritual insights that he wants us to learn from the book of nature, from which most of us are very, very divorced these days. Satan has done an excellent job of separating us from the soil. And we can have a clarity of mind that will allow us the discernment necessary in these troubling and final days. I thank you all